more federal workers are losing their jobs as the government shutdown and this political standoff drags on. Some of those firings now on hold as a federal judge in San Francisco ordered the administration on Wednesday to immediately stop the layoffs, ruling that they're unlawful. And in her decision, the judge said that the planned layoffs were politically motivated, adding, quote, "The politics that infuses what's going on is being trumpeted out loud in this case." So the ruling pauses the layoffs of more than 4,000 federal workers across 7 agencies, and that began last week. So those include workers at the IRS, the Treasury, cybersecurity workers at the Department of Homeland Security, also hundreds of CDC employees. Health and Human Services has seen nearly the entire special ed staff and also the special ed staff at the Education Department.
And you know all those layoffs we've been talking about? These federal workers getting fired permanently since Friday during the shutdown? Setback now on that for the Trump administration, because in just the last few hours, a federal judge has stopped those firings for now, saying they are not legal. So that's where things stand as of tonight, as of Wednesday night. That's after, remember, a couple of unions sued last month over that so-called RIF plan. RIFs, that's D.C. speak for reductions in force. So this judge now says the Trump administration has taken advantage of the lapse in government spending and government functioning to assume that all bets are off.
The federal judge is temporarily blocking the Trump administration from laying off thousands of federal workers during the government shutdown, calling the move unlawful. Today's order stems from a lawsuit filed by labor unions, including the American Federation of Government Employees. This comes as the White House budget chief is warning layoffs will likely reach, quote, north of 10,000. That's permanent layoffs, not just furloughs.
Okay, so let me tell you what just happened, because this is absolutely wild. The Supreme Court just stepped in and basically told Donald Trump, no, you can't do that. And I'm not talking about some minor thing here. I'm talking about the president of the United States trying to fire thousands of federal workers, trying to completely reshape the Department of Justice, and the highest court in the land just said stop, full stop, October 15th, 2025. That's the date you need to remember, because that's when a federal judge named Susan Ilston granted an injunction, basically a legal timeout, that blocks Trump's plan to conduct mass layoffs across the federal government. And here's the kicker. The Supreme Court, they're backing her up. They're signaling they're ready to step in if Trump tries any emergency moves to get around this. Can you believe this? Like we're watching a constitutional crisis play out in real time, and most people don't even realize what's happening. So let's back up for a second. What exactly was Trump trying to do? Well, during the government shutdown, yeah, that whole mess, his administration planned to purge thousands of federal workers. We're not talking about a few people here and there. We're talking about over 4,000 career staffers, people who've been doing their jobs for years, regardless of who's president, and Trump wanted them gone. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video. Why? Because he claims he needs direct control over federal agencies. He's been pushing this idea that the president should have complete authority over every part of the executive branch. No independence, no checks, just total control. And look, I get it. Some of you might be thinking, well, he's the president. Shouldn't he have control over his own administration? And yeah, that sounds reasonable on the surface. But here's what most people don't understand. There's a reason we have these protections in place. There's a reason federal agencies have some independence from political interference. It's called the Constitution. This whole thing has been brewing for months. The DOJ has been in chaos, internal fighting, mass resignations, budget cuts, controversial firings. Legal experts have been calling it a civil war inside the Department of Justice. And honestly, that's not even an exaggeration. Career lawyers have been battling political appointees. Whistleblowers coming forward, documents leaked left and right. It's been absolute mayhem. But now the Supreme Court just ended it, or at least they put it on pause. And this is huge, because even with a conservative majority, even with justices that Trump himself appointed, the court is saying no. They're drawing a line in the sand. Judge Emergit, in a related ruling about Trump trying to use National Guard units in Portland, wrote something that should be on every newspaper front page in America. She said, "This is a nation governed by constitutional law, not martial law." Come on. That's a federal judge basically saying the president is acting like a dictator. Let that sink in for a minute. In the Supreme Court, they've got multiple cases lined up this term that are all about testing the limits of Trump's power. One case involves him trying to fire Lisa Cook, a Federal Reserve governor. the Federal Reserve, an institution that's supposed to be completely independent from political pressure. But Trump wants her gone, and he's claiming he has the authority to do it. This is wild, this is unprecedented, and this is what happens when you have a president who genuinely believes there are no limits to executive power. Now unions representing these federal workers are calling this a clear victory, and yeah, it is, for now. Because the courts have basically said you can't just fire thousands of people because you want more control. But here's the thing, this fight isn't over, not by a long shot. Trump's legal team is already planning their next move. They're going to appeal, they're going to push back, they're going to argue that the president has inherent authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to do whatever he wants with the executive branch. And honestly, some legal scholars think they might have a point on some of that, but not all of it, not even close. The real question is, what happens next? Because we're heading into 2026 midterms, the opposition is energized, public trust in government institutions is at an all-time low, and now you've got the Supreme Court actively checking the president's power in ways we haven't seen since Watergate. Yeah, I said it, Watergate, because that's the comparison legal historians are making right now. This is that level of constitutional crisis. And you know what's even crazier? Most Americans have no idea this is happening. They're scrolling through social media, watching their regular shows, living their lives, and meanwhile, the entire structure of American government is being tested in ways it hasn't been tested in 50 years. This isn't just political drama. This isn't just Washington insider stuff. This affects every single person in this country. Because if Trump succeeds in expanding presidential power to the degree he wants, it doesn't just change things for his administration, it changes things forever, for every future president, from both parties. That's what makes this so important. That's why the Supreme Court stepping in right now is such a big deal. So buckle up, because what I'm about to explain in the next part is going to blow your mind about how we got here and why this matters way more than you think. All right, so let's dig into this, because there's so much happening beneath the surface that most news outlets aren't telling you about. And honestly, that's the problem with how political news gets covered these days. Everyone wants the headline, but nobody wants to explain the actual story. So here's what's really going on. Trump has been trying to fundamentally reshape how the federal government works since day one of his second term. And I'm not talking about normal policy changes or even controversial executive orders. I'm talking about trying to restructure the entire relationship between the presidency and federal agencies. There's this legal theory, and yeah, it's basically just a theory called the unitary executive. The basic idea is that the president, as head of the executive branch, should have complete control over every single person and agency within that branch. No independence, no protections for career civil servants, nothing. And look, constitutional scholars have been debating this for decades. Some think it makes sense, some think it's dangerous. But here's what nobody debates. It's never actually been fully implemented in American history, ever. Because every time a president has tried to push too far, the courts have stepped in and said no. Until now, Trump seemed to think he could finally make it happen. He's got a conservative Supreme Court. He's got loyalists throughout the judicial system. He thought this was his moment. But then October 15th happened. Judge Ilston dropped her ruling, and suddenly the whole plan fell apart. So what exactly did her ruling say? Well, she granted an injunction blocking the mass layoffs. But more importantly, she laid out a legal argument that basically demolishes Trump's entire theory of presidential power. She said that federal workers have due process rights. She said that agencies need independence to function properly. And she said that the president doesn't get to just ignore decades of established law because he wants more control. In the Supreme Court, they didn't have to weigh in yet. This is still just a district court ruling. But they sent signals through procedural moves and comments from justices that they're prepared to uphold these limits, that they're not going to let Trump steamroll over constitutional boundaries. Can you believe this? Like, even justices he appointed are basically saying, okay, we're conservative, but we're not going to let you become a king. Now, let's talk about what was actually happening inside the DOJ before this ruling, because the chaos there has been absolutely insane. You had career prosecutors resigning in protest. You had political appointees trying to take over cases. You had entire divisions being gutted through budget cuts and forced retirements. One whistleblower, and their identity is still protected, came forward and described it as the worst constitutional crisis I've witnessed in 30 years of government service. This person had worked through multiple administrations, both Republican and Democrat, and said they'd never seen anything like what's been happening under Trump. There were reports of meetings where political appointees literally told career lawyers, your job is to do what the president wants, not what the law says. Come on. That's not how any of this is supposed to work. In the Federal Reserve situation, that's even more alarming. The Fed is supposed to be completely independent. That's not just tradition, that's literally the law. Congress created the Federal Reserve to be insulated from political pressure so it can make economic decisions based on data, not on what the president wants for his poll numbers. But Trump has been trying to fire Lisa Cook, a Fed governor, because he doesn't like her policies. And he's arguing that as president, he has the authority to remove any federal official he wants. If that sounds familiar, it's because we've seen this before. Trump tried similar things in his first term. Courts blocked him then too. But now he's back and he's trying again. And he seems convinced that this time it'll work. Except it's not working. The courts are holding the line. Legal experts are comparing this to some of the most important Supreme Court cases in history. Cases that define the separation of powers. Cases that established judicial review. Cases that made sure no president, no matter how popular or powerful, could become a dictator. And yeah, I use that word again, dictator, because that's what we're talking about here. When you strip away all the legal jargon and political spin, what Trump has been trying to do is consolidate power in a way that would make the presidency fundamentally different from what the founders intended. The thing is, most Americans don't really understand how government is supposed to work. They think the president is like a CEO and the federal government is like a company. But it's not. It's specifically designed with checks and balances to prevent any one person from having too much power. That's why we have 3 branches of government. That's why agencies have independence. That's why career civil servants have job protections. It's all meant to ensure that the government serves the people, not just whoever happens to be president at the moment. And when those protections start breaking down, that's when democracies fail. I'm not being dramatic here. This is literally what historians study. This is what political scientists warn about. When executive power becomes unchecked, bad things happen. So the unions representing these 4,000 federal workers, they're celebrating, and they should be, because this ruling means their jobs are safe for now. It means they can keep doing the work they were hired to do without fear of being fired for political reasons. But it also means something bigger. It means the system is working. The checks and balances are holding. The courts are doing their job, at least for now. Because here's what worries me and what should worry everyone. This isn't over. Trump's administration is already planning appeals. They're going to take this fight all the way back to the Supreme Court if they have to. And when they get there, they're going to make the strongest possible argument for expanded presidential power. And honestly, I don't know how the Supreme Court will rule on the full case. This injunction is just temporary. The real legal battle is still ahead. But what I do know is this. We're living through a historic moment. Whatever happens next is going to define the presidency for generations. Either the courts will continue to hold the line and maintain the constitutional order, or they'll cave to presidential pressure and fundamentally reshape American government. There's no middle ground here. This is it. This is the fight. And here's something else that's not getting enough attention. The timing of all this. We're in the middle of a government shutdown. Federal workers are already stressed about whether they're getting paid, and now they're also worried about whether they're getting fired. Can you imagine trying to do your job under those conditions? It's chaos, pure chaos. And that's exactly what happens when you try to run government like a reality TV show instead of, an actual government. The other thing that's interesting is how quiet some Republicans have been about this. You'd think they'd be defending Trump's actions, right? But a lot of them are just silent because even they know this looks bad. Even they understand that going too far on executive power could backfire when a Democrat is president again. That's the thing about precedent. Whatever Trump gets away with now, future presidents can do too. And I don't think Republicans really want a future Democratic president to have unlimited power to fire anyone they want and control every agency without oversight. So there's this weird tension where Trump's pushing hard, but his own party isn't fully backing him. They're hedging their bets, waiting to see how the courts rule before they commit one way or the other. And that tells you something. It tells you this is controversial, even among people who generally support Trump's policies. So let's break this down into the key points you actually need to understand. Because with all the legal complexity and political drama, it's easy to lose track of what really matters here. Point 1, the Supreme Court just became the most important check on presidential power we have right now. And that's saying something, because Congress is supposed to be that check. But Congress has been completely dysfunctional. The House and Senate can't agree on anything. So the courts are stepping up. Judge Ilston's ruling on October 15th was just the beginning. We've got multiple cases heading to the Supreme Court this term that all revolve around the same basic question. How much power does the president really have? Can he fire independent agency heads? Can he override civil service protections? Can he restructure entire departments without congressional approval? These aren't theoretical questions anymore. These are real cases with real consequences. And based on the signals we're seeing, the Supreme Court is ready to say no, at least on the most extreme claims. Point 2, this whole situation shows why agency independence matters. Like, why do we even have rules protecting federal workers from political firing? Seems kind of weird, right? The president should be able to hire and fire whoever he wants in his own administration. But here's the thing. These aren't political appointees. These are career civil servants, scientists at the EPA, lawyers at the DOJ, economists at the Federal Reserve. These are people with expertise who are supposed to do their jobs based on facts and law, not based on political pressure. Imagine if every time a new president came in, they could fire everyone and replace them with loyalists. You'd have scientists ignoring climate data because the president doesn't like it. You'd have lawyers dropping cases because they're politically inconvenient. You'd have economists manipulating reports to make the administration look good. That's not how a functioning government works. That's how corruption works. So when Trump tried to fire thousands of these workers, he wasn't just cutting government waste or draining the swamp or whatever political slogan you want to use. He was trying to turn the entire federal government into a political operation, and the court said no. And you know what? Good, because we need government agencies that actually work. We need scientists who follow the science. We need lawyers who follow the law. We need economists who follow the data. That's how you run a country properly. Point 3. The comparison to Watergate is actually pretty accurate. And this is where it gets really interesting. Because during Watergate, the courts also had to step in and check presidential power. Nixon thought he was above the law. He thought executive privilege meant he could hide evidence and obstruct justice. The Supreme Court unanimously told him he was wrong. In that case, United States versus Nixon is still one of the most important Supreme Court decisions in history because it established once and for all that no president is above the law. We might be watching a similar moment unfold right now. These cases about Trump's power could become the defining legal precedents for how much authority presidents have in the 21st century. Are you kidding me? We're literally living through history, and half the country doesn't even realize it. The parallels are striking. Back then, you had a president who thought the rules didn't apply to him. You had people in his administration breaking laws and then claiming they were just following orders. You had courts finally stepping in and saying enough is enough. Sound familiar? Because it should. This is the same pattern. Different details, but the same basic story of executive overreach being checked by the judicial branch. Point 4, and this is crucial. The 2026 midterms are going to be wild because the opposition is now energized in a way they haven't been since the last election. This court ruling gives them something concrete to point to. Proof that Trump's overreach is real. Proof that the system can push back. Expect to see this case in every campaign ad. Expect candidates to run on protecting the independence of federal agencies. Expect massive turnout from both sides because everyone now understands the stakes. This isn't just about Trump anymore. This is about what kind of government we want. Do we want a strong presidency with few limits? Or do we want the traditional system of checks and balances? That's the question voters are going to answer in 2026. And honestly, I have no idea which way it'll go. The country is split, like really split. Half the country thinks Trump is trying to save America from a corrupt bureaucracy. The other half thinks he's trying to become a dictator. And both sides have dug in so deep that they can't even have a conversation anymore. That's what makes this moment so dangerous. Because when you can't agree on basic facts, when you can't even agree on what the Constitution means, how do you move forward as a country? Now, what happens next in the short term? Well, Trump's legal team is definitely going to appeal. They have to. They've staked too much political capital on this fight to back down now. So expect this to move up through the court system pretty quickly. The Supreme Court could take up the case as early as this term. And when they do, it's going to be one of the most watched cases in decades because the implications are enormous. If the court sides with Trump, even partially, it could open the door to massive expansions of presidential power. Future presidents from both parties would have more authority to reshape the government in their image. If the court sides against Trump, it would be a historic rebuke of executive overreach. It would strengthen civil service protections and agency independence for generations. There's no middle ground here. The court is going to have to choose. And here's the really wild part. We don't know which way they'll go. Yeah, it's a conservative court. But as we've seen with this injunction, even conservative justices care about the Constitution. They care about precedent. They care about the institutional role of the courts. So this isn't as simple as Republican justices will side with the Republican president. It's way more complicated than that. Some of these justices have spent their entire career studying constitutional law. They've written books about separation of powers. They've taught classes on executive authority. And now they have to decide whether to uphold everything they've said in the past or to side with the president who's pushing boundaries they previously said shouldn't be pushed. That's a tough spot to be in, and it's going to be fascinating to watch how they handle it. The other thing to watch is how other federal judges handle similar cases, because there are multiple lawsuits happening right now challenging different aspects of Trump's restructuring plans. If judges around the country keep ruling against the administration, it builds momentum for the Supreme Court to do the same. But if Trump wins some of these lower court cases, it muddies the waters and makes it harder to predict what the Supreme Court will do. So where does this leave us? Well, for now, those 4,000 federal workers get to keep their jobs. The DOJ civil war is on pause, and the courts are asserting themselves as a real check on presidential power. But the underlying tensions haven't gone away. Trump still believes he should have unchecked authority. His supporters still think he's fighting against a corrupt bureaucracy, and the legal battles are going to continue for months, if not years. This is far from over. This is just the beginning of what could be the most important constitutional fight of our lifetimes. And honestly, we should all be paying attention, because whatever gets decided here is going to affect how our government works for decades to come. Think about it. Your kids are going to read about this in history books. They're going to study these court cases in school. They're going to ask you, what was it like living through that? And you better have a good answer, because this is the kind of moment that defines an era. This is the kind of fight that shapes the future of democracy itself. So yeah, buckle up, keep your eyes on the Supreme Court. Watch how these cases develop, because this is the kind of moment that ends up in history books, and we're living through it right now. The next few months are going to be absolutely critical. Every ruling matters, every decision counts, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Next time, we're going to dive into what this means for the Federal Reserve case specifically, because that one might be even more important than the DOJ situation. We're going to talk about why central bank independence matters, what happens if Trump gets his way, and how this could affect the economy for years to come. You're not going to want to miss it.